You want to do your budgets early. You want to identify your team. So here's my strategic planning advice. You're thinking about what you need the money for and what work you want to do. At the same time, you got to think about what people you need, where they're going to come from, what physical resources you need, and how much it's going to cost. Because you've got to fit into these frameworks. Question?
Yes, researchers, they usually have more than 500 employees, right? So, but on the other hand, the collaborations are encouraged. So I wonder if there are any type of collaborations that would violate the rule.
So a subcontract to a university is not an affiliation. So no issue. No issue.
So you can do any type of collaboration with the university?
Well, in an SBIR or unless the university controls the company somehow, you will not violate the affiliation rules.
But if, for example, the university owns the IP?
That's okay. If the university owns the IP, there is an affiliation issue related to IP, and it has to do with, once they license it to you, who stands to carry the profit and loss. Assuming under the terms of the license that you will ultimately get, you bear the right to both profit and to loss, then there's no affiliation. If the university gives you a weird license that says they maintain the P&L responsibility, then there's an affiliation. I've never seen that. You know, I've been 17 years of licensing agreements, I've never seen that. But it's clearly, that's one of the 9 affiliation provisions. But this causes no issue as far as affiliation is concerned. Yes, sir? What if your consultant is a Canadian? What's the head nod rule? Can't have a Canadian consultant. Unless they come here and do the work here and you pay them here. But you cannot pay someone who's in Canada because that's not in the United States. Okay? You can pay them with other monies, but here's the deal. You want to be very careful. You can bring certain resources to the project, but there can't be cash contingencies, okay? Or you're going to have, if you say, well, look, you know, I'm going to take $50,000 of my own money and pay for this piece, you're going to have a problem. But if you say, we've got an advisor on board who is going to be providing some input at no cost to the program, you might be able to get some input from that person. Yes, sir?
What if your business is such that you have a developed product, let's say the software is being developed, it's been sold to companies, it's been proven, now you need biz dev and you need marketing?
Wrong, you're in the wrong place. SBIR only pays for the R&D piece of it. So if it's already developed and there's no more technical risk, then you're not in the right, then SBIR is not any longer a relevant source of funding. So the question is, I want to rent a machine shop where I can develop my product. And again, this depends on how you're renting it. If you're personnel, if you're saying, this is my facility and I rent this machine shop and my people work here, that's fine. But if you say, there's a machinist at this machine shop and I need to hire him or her to do some work, then that's outsourced. Okay? Yes, sir?
Is it more attractive for SBIR and STTR? For instance, Stony Brook has the Center for Biotechnology, which I've worked with for the last 3 years, supporting the company, which provided market analysis, things of that sort for us, because we're scientists, no expertise in commercialization. As you just said, you're like, I'm scared to death of that part. That sounds like then that's where I have to go because I need this support.
So that's one of many examples of resources that help early stage technology entrepreneurs to address the commercialization issues. So when we talk about building a proposal, and again, I apologize, it really does take me 2 full days to train people on how to write these in detail, okay? But when we talk about building a strong proposal, we have to do 3 things. We have to assemble a team of qualified scientists and engineers to do the work. We have to find the right physical facilities and resources to help us do the work. And we then also have to develop a team of commercialization expertise, resources. And oftentimes for early stage companies, that's exactly where it comes from. Whether it's SBDCs with EIRs, whether it's universities that have entrepreneurship programs and resources, other local and state economic development organizations, all can provide those early stages of commercialization help. You want to describe those in your proposal. And each agency, you'll describe it in a different place. But you can't use the SBIR monies to pay for it. Okay? So that's where there's confusion by people. Phase 1 and phase 2 is R&D. You will be paying technical people to do technical work in a research facility. But you will have to describe the other non-technical resources that you have, where they're coming from and how you're maintaining them to get me comfortable that you aren't a clueless scientist, or I don't want to give you my money. Because one thing I'll be very clear on, SBIR does not fund science fair projects. Yes, sir.
How is the validation is there an auditing process that they have? How do you ascertain that you have these funds that you say you do?
Yeah.
And that you spend it in the manner you
So this is an excellent question, and it speaks to when Gloria was introducing us and saying all the things we do, and she said something about post-award stuff, and she said don't underestimate the importance of this. So is there an auditing process? First of all, what's part A of every answer? Depends on the agency. Every agency has audit processes, but some are more proactive than others. When you submit an SBIR and you push the submit button, there is a signature on every proposal. Sometimes it's just a checkbox. You say, I agree to follow every single rule, and I'm giving you many of the rules, okay? Once you get a notice of award, it'll be a contract from a contracting agency, a grant from a granting agency, and you take the first dollar, you've just executed that contract. And everything with SBIR is self-certified. Whether you're audited or not, proactively depends on the agency, but if you are audited, you have to be able to provide proof of all of this. Some agencies at the time of award will ask for what they call just-in-time information, which may include a copy of your lease, evidence that you've got the right financial control systems in place, evidence that you've got a chart of accounts that's compliant. There's a whole list of things, okay? Chris Bergman in my office is our government accounting and grants management expert. And she spends the vast majority of her time working both on electronic submission, but on pre-award, post-submission. NIH calls you, says we want to fund you. DOD calls you, says we want to fund you. She works with our clients to get them ready, and then once they take the money, she can periodically monitor what you're doing to make sure you're compliant. And each agency has its own processes. But in all cases, if they never show up at your door, but she just met you here, she finds out you get an award. She put in a proposal, she didn't get one. She walks down the hall and says, wow, he's not compliant, and picks up the phone, or better yet, goes to one of the agency's hot links that the Congress now makes them put on every single SBIR webpage. There is a hot link that says report cases of fraud, waste, and abuse. Where do you think the majority of issues are coming from? People who are reporting them, and then they will absolutely be out to audit you. So everything by SBIR is self-certified. Ignorance is not, unfortunately, a defense. Yes, sir?
Let me just modify the question I asked you before. You have the technology, it's proven in area A. You believe it's going to work in area B. Let's say medical, it's working in some other area. And you want to modify it, adapt it, and that's the R&D part of it. But it's based on a core technology that's working. Is that valid?
Maybe. Maybe. And again, do you still have 3.5 years and a lot of technology risk to reduce to practice? And beyond that, it's project and agency specific. So the best answer I can give you is maybe. Okay, and then we can talk more about it. Yes, sir?
I'm managing a company located here. Same kind of idea which I have developed is related to the foreign mission. I want to bring that here to do that.
So I'm a U.S. company. The technology I want to develop has been developed overseas by foreign nationals. Can I bring it and them here to do the work? Yes, as long as you bring them here under the right visa so that they've got the right to work here and the work is done here and you meet all the other requirements. The answer is yes. Okay? Okay, let me come to, oh, sorry. It was a reluctant hand.
Yeah, supposing subcontracting in testing your product that you need, it needs to be tested in the field, and the subcontracting is not done with the university.
So in an SBIR, there is no university requirement. That 1/3 and 1/2 can be done with anybody.
Okay, but the affiliate part,
It's no problem.
as long as you're subcontracting,
Yeah.
there's no problem.
Yes. Okay, let me come to the STTR and then I'll address your question and then I'll take any other questions on this whole area of the difference between SBIR and STTR. So we've got, let me come to PI. So we know the difference between the two mechanisms as it pertains to who does what where, yes? Let's look at the other piece which has to do with principal investigator. Every SBIR and STTR proposal needs to have, and here's an important concept, and this is going to be different than the basic research grants that some of you may have written at the university. It's all about, there is no I in team, right? You know, stupid thing to say, but one of the strategic things that makes strong SBIRs and STTRs are teams. Why? Because we're now no longer just studying this material and its properties and the conformational structure of the molecules, but we're looking at how we can take it and apply it to the bottom of ocean-going vessels to keep them from fouling in certain oceans where the military sends all their ships. So now we need just not material scientists, but we might need engineers, we might need oceanographers, we might need all different kinds of expertise. So SBIRs and STTRs are teams. Some of the teams that people come, there are employees, their employees are subcontractors, they're consultants. But every proposal identifies a principal investigator, the chief scientist, engineer, technical person who's responsible for overseeing this project and also has the necessary scientific, technical, clinical, computer-based, mathematics-based, physics-based expertise to do the work on this project in collaboration with the team and manage the team. We have some employment requirements for PI that are different between SBIR and STTR. So there are two things you need to understand. The difference between employment status and percent effort on a project. Employment status is where you work. Percent effort on a project is what you do while you're at work, and those are not necessarily the same thing. The other thing, you may not believe me, but when I tell you this, it's true, you cannot be more than 100% employed, by definition, no matter how hard you work. So whether he works 30 hours a week and he works 100 hours a week, if that's what their employer deems to be full-time, they're 100% employed. So with those definitions in mind, for an SBIR, the PI, principal investigator, must maintain his or her primary employment with the small business at the time of and for the duration of the award, and primary employment says more than 50%. So you cannot, at least 51%. You cannot be, therefore, more than 49% employed anywhere else at the time of and for the duration of the award. So if you currently work full-time at the university, you must implement a 51% leave of absence at the time of award and maintain that leave for the duration of the award in order to be a qualified PI on all SBIRs and on the National Science Foundation's STTR. For the other four agencies with STTRs, we now have two organizations collaborating. Who is the applicant? Small business. They have at least one person working at the company. Stony Brook has at least one person working at the university. They are collaborating, and now the PI can either be at the company or at the university, as long as he or she has the ability to meet the minimum percent effort on the project. And each agency establishes an acceptable minimum effort on a project. It's typically somewhere around 10%. Sometimes it's number of hours per week, sometimes it's based on 100% effort. So PI for an SBIR has to be 51% or more employed by the company and at least 10% effort on the project. And then an STTR for NASA, Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, and DOD, the PI can either work at the company or the nonprofit as long as they have at least 10% effort on the project. Okay? All right, let me address the conflict of interest issues because two people have asked. So, regardless of SBIR or STTR, the programs themselves, and this is my term I use to try and explain it, are essentially agnostic when it comes to conflict of interest. There are no specific rules that says who has to work where they can be compensated, okay? They're strictly the reviewers and whether or not they think a project is appropriate. Conflict of interest comes into play when somebody is working in more than one place and stands to benefit financially from both. And or when somebody has a financial motivation in place A that might affect what they do in place B. And so this tends to affect faculty-based startups that spin out of universities, okay? And if you are a faculty entrepreneur and you've invented technology that you are an inventor on IP owned by a university, and then you start a company and you license that technology or discuss options to license that technology and you're an owner, you have an inherent conflict of interest, maybe more than one. SBIR does not specify how those conflicts have to be managed. The institution does. So you have to know your institution's conflict of interest policies and procedures. And I have worked with institutions all over the map. Some are like the Wild Wild West. Faculty can do everything. They can start a company. They can do work in their lab. They can run across the street and do work at their company. They can get their spouse involved. They can do anything. The university doesn't care. I've worked with other universities where once you're a faculty entrepreneur, if there's an SBIR or STTR to your company, you can essentially do nothing. Both of those to me are problematic scenarios. And then it's the big bubble in the bell curve in the middle, where there are conflict of interest management policies and procedures that institutions have to help make things clean. I never advise, this is my opinion, if you're a faculty and you own part of a company that's licensing your IP, pick where you want to do the work of the SBIR or STTR. You're either going to work on the company's budget or you're going to work on the university's budget, and if there's a subcontract back to the university, someone else is doing that work, and if that work is in your lab at the university, then you have to determine whether or not A, the university will let you do it, and B, if they do, how they're going to make sure you manage it. One way is to have someone else managing that project. So that's the generic answer. Not, if you have a specific scenario, I'm happy to address it, or we can talk. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Yes, sir.
On the budget and certification of research institution in that area, on phase one, let's say there's a clear understanding of a budget with the institution, but phase two is not yet developed because it involves other institutions at the same time. Does that have to be on the application?
Your phase one does not have to address your phase two budget. So your phase one, you deal with your phase one budget, your phase two, you deal with your phase two budget. What
So
you
that
will,
gets at a later date on the application?
yeah, well, so you apply for phase one only. You've got to get the phase one funded, you do the work, then you apply for your phase two. So they're applied as two separate applications for almost everything. There are a few programs that allow you to submit them simultaneously. But for the vast majority of agencies and programs, they're submitted as two separate proposals. You will definitely indicate in your phase one what you intend to do in phase two. If I don't know what you intend to do in phase two, I can't judge whether or not your phase one makes sense. But beyond that, there's no additional detail in the phase one proposal. It says, this is what I'm going to do with this $150,000 over this 6-month period with these people in these facilities. Here's the outcome. Here's the way I'm going to prove the F-word feasibility. And then this is what we'll be doing in phase two. But the details of phase two will be articulated in your phase two proposal.
So does that basically say that there will be a year between phase one and phase two minimum?
That basically says that there will be anywhere from, depending on the agency and how you manage your budget, 3 months to 12 months between phase one and phase two. Absolutely. So all of you should be thinking grant strategy and other fundraising strategies. For those of you with a life science, healthcare interest, NIH has April, August, and December. So we talk about putting in a proposal every cycle. For those of you that have other agencies, the strategy is a little different, but we build a grants portfolio or a contracts portfolio if we can, so that at some point, we do not ever become a grant mill, but we become strategic in our use of non-dilutive funding to help support that R&D while we're raising other capital, and that can be multiple awards. Yes? So the question is, you write for phase one, you don't want to sit around doing nothing, so you get all the work done before you get awarded. So let me tackle this in a couple of pieces, okay? Number one, first and foremost, know it's 6 months before you're going to see any money. Plan accordingly, okay? Number two, if you're fortunate enough to have resources in the company, not everyone is, to allow you to start the work early, depending on the agency. Some agencies will allow you to have what's called 90-day pre-award costs, which means that you can reimburse yourself for up to 90 days prior to the start of the award, which then means you can finish that much sooner, which then means you can put your phase two in that much sooner, okay? Beyond that, it's going to be agency specific, and I'll show you a little bit more this afternoon about the specific agencies, but managing the money and the work in detail is going to be an agency specific activity. And all of these questions, I hope, are reinforcing my point that it's the strategic planning that's the hardest and most important part. When you assemble a team, when you long-term, and how long are we strategically planning for? 4 years minimum. I always say you got to flash forward 5 years and you got to look backwards and say, where do I expect to be in 5 years from a product development perspective? And hopefully it's more than one product. What do I need to use as building blocks to fund my R&D to get there? What are the right agencies, timing, strategically that I can use this money? That's when you're, and then who do I need? Where am I going to do the work? That's how we put together well-crafted proposals. Okay, when you think about what you want to do with this money for 6 months in a phase one, not so good. Okay? Okay. So as far as SBIR and STTR are concerned, how do you decide? Well, you have to decide whether or not the agency has a program, and what do you have, what do you need, where are you going to get what you don't have. If you have everything you need, SBIR tends to be the more appropriate, but for those of you with NIH or Department of Energy, or NSF, particularly if you're coming out of a university, and you'll see that this afternoon, STTR may be a very appropriate mechanism for you. Yes, ma'am?
Can you apply for both?
Can you apply for both? For the same project? Typically the answer is no. So let me just talk about multiple applications for a minute and genericize your question. There is no rule against putting in multiple proposals to multiple agencies that are overlapping or for the same work. But it is illegal to take money from more than one source for the same work. So from a strategic perspective, we tend to say you're better off not submitting overlapping applications. But if you do, so I guess part of the answer is, to your question, it depends. If two different agencies have solicitations open, one's an SBIR and one's an STTR, yes, you can technically put in a proposal to both, but if there's any overlap, you could only take one award at most. Within an agency, they're getting more and more particular, so you will typically never be able to put in the same project to multiple solicitations within an agency. You have to pick. Okay? Yes, sir.
One more. Maybe, I hope you didn't address this one earlier, but I know this may be agency specific, but I can see two scenarios. One is that the agencies have a lot of money to give out, and they have less people applying, so they have to, they judge based on that. The other is a lot of applicants, a little bit of money, and so, it works out. What, is there a typical?
So I almost finished an MBA. I never did finish it, but there was in those old classes of the laws of free markets where, say, supply and demand typically equal out. That's what's happened in SBIR. Most of the agencies have very similar funding rates. Okay, the funding rates across, so yes, one has a lot more money than another, but they have a lot more demand, if I understand your question correctly. So funding rates across the board in the last few years have tended to be about 10 to 15% of phase ones received by the various agencies get funded, and somewhere in the order of 35 to 45% of the phase twos get funded. There is some variability, it goes up and down. In years past, NIH was a little bit less competitive with slightly higher funding percentages. In the last few years, they've been extremely competitive, and because of some changes, I think things might ease up a little bit in NIH in the next couple of years. But in general, those are the statistics.
Just one quick follow-up. What if you have a product you work in multiple markets?
Yeah.
And as I said before, you want to develop this, say, for the medical market. So I assume the company is free to go ahead in the other markets, not using this money, but do whatever they
The agency, so to address the question of what if you have multiple markets and multiple applications for your technology. So let me answer this in two different general ways. First of all, the more applications for the technology, the better. The more likely you are to be a more robust, more successful company. However, the strategy for applying for SBIRs is almost always one of focus. Okay? So if you have medical applications, you want to be even more focused than medical applications, and maybe this is, although it could be used for chronic diseases including diabetes, congestive heart failure, and obesity, we're going to target congestive heart failure for this particular application. So applications tend to be more successful when they're very focused, but companies are more successful when they can leverage that funding. And so it's good to have multiple applications, but you have to be narrow in your SBIR because of money.
Well, you said this before. Suppose it is medical, and suppose your technology would work for diabetes and work for some other disease process. Would that both be to the NIH, let's say, would it be to different agencies within the NIH?
It depends. So if you have multiple clinical applications for one technology, you might have multiple NIH applications, you might not, depending on how similar or different they are, and or you might have multiple agency strategies. So all of the above are potentially yes or no, okay? And when we dig into the agencies a little more, I think you'll start to understand where there may or may not be overlap or synergy, okay? Okay. Just a couple of quick things I want to clear up. These are misconceptions. I just want to make sure that nobody has them. Universities can apply for STTRs, yes? No, they can't. If the university is involved, you have to do an STTR?
Yes.
No, absolutely not. You can do an SBIR and have a university involved. If the IP comes from a university, you have to do an STTR? No, we don't care where the IP comes from, you can do either. If the inventor or key scientist is faculty, you have to do an STTR? No, that's usually code for I want to be the PI. Okay, but you don't have to do an STTR. And here's one that I didn't address. My company writes an STTR proposal. It gets funded. I subcontract to Stony Brook, and this nice gentleman here is my principal investigator, because he's got much more background than me. So I've now hired Stony Brook to do some of the work. I'm doing some of the work. He's PI. He's overseeing the project. Whose grant is it? The company's grant. So university faculty tend to refer to STTRs as their grants when they're PIs. They're not. Guess what I can do if he's not doing a good job? You fire. And I can go hire another university with another PI. So it's important that you understand that even with STTRs, when faculty are PI, it is not the university's grant, it is the company's. The company is subcontracting to the university, and part of that subcontract includes the role of principal investigator. Okay? Okay. I just want to talk about a few more reauthorization topics, okay, to bring you up to speed on some of the other changes going on. As I mentioned earlier, but just to clarify, Congress passes legislation, the SBA drafts the rules and regulations, the agencies implement the changes. That is happening this year, okay? So it's a 2-year process. The other document I referred to earlier is the policy directive. So all of the other changes outside of ownership, control, and size are published in the policy directive. We expect to see a reissue of this document sometime this year. I don't know when, but the SBIR already talked about making some changes, so you might want to keep your eyes on that. One of the nice things about reauthorization is the increasing set-aside. So SBIR was stuck at the same percentage for many years as was STTR. With the 6-year reauthorization, we've got escalating or increasing set-aside. So as a percentage of the agency's budgets, SBIR and STTR are both increasing. STTR is actually increasing over the 6 years by 50%. So though it's a much smaller number, it's a very substantial increase. So SBIR and STTR's budget goes as the agency's budget goes. But the cool thing is, things like sequestration, the agencies cannot selectively cut their SBIR or STTR budgets, okay? Because by law, they have to set it aside, all right? And then the funding caps, legislatively mandated, and this is new, and this is primarily affecting NIH, because NIH in the last 10 years has given some really big awards, is now going to be capped at $225 for a phase 1 and $1.5 million for a phase 2. That is a maximum. It doesn't mean the agencies have to award that much, and you'll see some agencies will not hit those caps. So it will be agency specific, mechanism specific. It might even be solicitation specific. So within a Department of Defense solicitation, you might see Army having budget A and Navy having budget cap B, okay? So to all of you who wanted to know how quickly the awards are made, the Congress is pushing very heavily on the agencies to make their awards more rapidly, and they are also focusing on increased outreach, which is why you're seeing FAST funding that's funding this event today, going also to try and help recruit more minority and women-owned companies into the SBIR program. That's a big focus for Congress. Invitation-only phase 2s for the contracting agencies. Is anyone in here used to working with DOD or got a focus on Department of Defense or NASA? So if you were familiar at all with the way SBIR worked in the past, DOD released a SBIR solicitation. Anyone know what SBIR is? SBIR, okay? So now, from now on, whenever you hear the term SBIR, you will know that it's DOD, okay? So when DOD releases a SBIR solicitation in the past, they would award phase 1s, and then when it was time for phase 2s, they would do what they call down select. They would look at those phase 1 awardees, they'd decide which ones they liked, and they would invite a select number for phase 2. Congress banned that going forward. So DOD is no longer allowed to down select. Anyone who gets a phase 1 is authorized, has the right to submit a phase 2 for DOD. It's going to be very interesting to see how DOD handles this. It's my speculation that they will figure out a way to make it very clear to their phase 1 awardees as to whether or not they are interested in phase 2. And as you hear about how the differences are for working with agencies, you'll see why this makes sense. But DOD claims that they will be very removed from that process. So we'll see. One of the other changes that SBIR authorizes is the ability to switch between SBIR and STTR between phase 1 and phase 2. So we had a client a couple of years ago with an STTR phase 1. They decided they no longer needed the university in the phase 2. They contacted the program director at NIH, who said yes, you can switch to an SBIR phase 2. And unfortunately, the program director didn't have the authority to approve that. And when you learn enough about NIH, you realize that it's a complicated organization. Not everyone has the authority to make those kinds of decisions. They have to put it in the phase 2 SBIR, the Center for Scientific Review at NIH, which was called grants, rejected it. And would not accept it, even though they had in writing that they were approved to put it in. With reauthorization, this provision is now supposedly allowable across all the agencies, which is kind of cool, gives you more flexibility. For those of you that haven't contracted law operating company, only you, and then are going to apply to NIH now, that applies to anyone in the room, but NIH cap is how much money they award to contract law operating company owned applicants. So Congress gave the ability to those companies to be eligible, but cap the amount of money that the agencies can award to them. This one I like, and I wanted to just highlight this a lot. Each individual company's story is absolutely relevant to them. When taken in the aggregate, though, they tend to be each, anecdotal. So for every war story I get, I've got one on the other side of the fence. You are going to hear people tell you that forget about that thing on commercialization. I got all kinds of SBIRs funded and I had very little, if any, commercialization information in it. So that's not true anymore. Focus on commercialization is huge in SBIRs and STTRs, and Congress has reinforced this through some of the provisions. There's actually going to be additional reporting that you, the applicant, are going to have to do when you start to get multiple SBIRs, and there's additional reporting. Most of the burden of this is going to fall on the agencies to track commercialization outcomes more aggressively. So focus on commercialization is real, and I think it's a good improvement in SBIR and STTR. The downside, or the other side of this, is this focus on fraud, waste, and abuse. And I mentioned it briefly, but Congress went on a bit of a witch hunt back about 3 years ago when they were in the midst of the stress of reauthorization. The National Academies of Sciences did a big study on SBIR and STTR and demonstrated very clearly with data how successful and compelling this program has been and how strong the commercialization outcomes have been. But what Congress did was charter a subcommittee to take a look at the instances of fraud, waste, and abuse. And they found some pretty interesting, albeit what I consider to be very anecdotal examples of problems with people misusing money. So they heightened the language in the reauthorization to target companies, and so this is to the gentleman's question of how is their compliance. The agencies don't have bigger budgets for compliance, but they have to try and address fraud, waste, and abuse more. So one thing they're all doing, and you'll see this when you go to their websites, is you'll see a link on every agency's SBIR homepage that says report cases of fraud, waste, and abuse. And a couple of things that I like to focus on, just to make you aware that they're really picking on. So a company-controlled research facility, you better be doing work in it. If you need to find a different facility, that's fine, but you must have company-controlled research facilities, and you must be doing, you can't just have it, you gotta be doing the work in it. You got a $200,000 phase one and you're going to spend $150,000 at the company. Where are you spending that money? In the company's facility. That's number one. Number two, if you've got employees who work somewhere else, particularly PIs, and they say they're taking a leave of absence, it does not bode well if you find out they never went to the university to reduce their effort. They're still collecting full salary on the university side and their PI of an SBIR. That's extremely problematic. And the third issue has to do with reporting data. When you do a phase one and you complete it, you write a final report, and that data goes as part of your phase two. When you complete a phase two, you write a final report and you submit it to the agency, and in that report is your technical data. If you are subcontracting to a university and there are graduate students and postdocs in the laboratory, and they are also collecting data from other grants, you have to be very careful. If this nice guy is working on his PhD or is doing a postdoc and he collected some data and then that shows up in your SBIR report, that's double dipping, or vice versa. So those are things to be careful of with fraud, waste, and abuse. If you set up your financial control systems properly, if you've got all of your policies and procedures in place, and if you are adhering to them, you should not have any issues with this. Okay? But it's important that you're aware of it. Here's another really cool thing. How many of you knew that once you get one SBIR or STTR from any agency, if the product that you develop long-term as a result of that funding is wanted by the government, you have sole source acquisition preference? This is a very cool thing. So if any of you have any interest in commercializing to the federal government in any way, shape, or form, if they are a potential customer, if you're getting funded by DOD, as you'll see this afternoon, chances are good that they are. If you're funded by NIH or NSF, NIH and NSF are not acquisition agencies, but you might be developing a medical device that NIH funds that the Army wants to use out in the field. If you had any SBIR or STTR funding into that, you have sole source justification. And further than that, the government is required by law to give you acquisition preference. And assuming that you can meet the procurement requirements, they preferentially need to buy from you through sole source. Unfortunately, many of the acquisition, what are they called? The contracting officers are not aware of this provision in the law. And as is presented to me many times by attorneys at national SBIR conferences, the law trumps the federal acquisition regulations, which is what most contracting officers know is what's called the FAR. So this is a right that you need to be aware of, and in the event that you get SBIR or STTR funding, and you have something that the government wants, this is a very powerful preference that you have, okay?
This just means your product had to be put on the market, meaning it reached commercialization through SBIR funding.
All it says is, let's say you get a phase one SBIR to develop a medical device. You never get any more SBIR money. You decide, your rich uncle dies and you come into money and you say, forget it, I'm going to fund the rest of this thing myself. Army comes around 3 years later, says, want to buy that from you. Because you had phase 1 SBIR, they can sole source justify. Similarly, Army doesn't know you exist, but you see an RFP out. You know that Army wants to buy that. You can go to them and say, hey, I have this. It meets your procurement specs, and I have SBIR funding as part of the development. You have to buy preferentially from me. Okay? That's what it means. And you don't ever have to have used more than one SBIR. Okay?
So actually, I'm sorry,
Just all you need is just one SBIR award. The product has to be a direct result of that phase 1, right? So it's typically more than that. But it is part of the law.
So what if you had a building material that you create, and they're building tons of buildings? You can go in and tell the government they have to use this?
Pretty much.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
let me put it to you this way. You can tell them that the law states that you've got an acquisition preference. And then you'll probably be hiring an attorney. I know one firm that does this, that represents you and helps educate the government as to that process. Hopefully, you know early on that the government's a potential customer. And hopefully, early on, you're nurturing that relationship. You're developing something that meets their standards, and you're educating them so that they're excited to the fact that you can solve their problem with a whole lot less paperwork.
Yeah, because
But-
I can't see pissing them off. And
No,
let's
but
say get
I'm
to
just
one.
saying that this is a provision in the law that a lot of acquisition officers are not familiar with, but I think a lot of SBIR companies are not familiar with. For the majority of them, it's a non-issue because the government isn't your long-term commercialization strategy. But for those of you funded through DOD SBIRs, those DOD folks know, but the broader federal requirement is there. So, and I just think it's something that most companies are naive to. Yes, sir.
Let's say you get a phase 1. At the end of that phase, you're writing a report, filling out the forms. How burdensome are the counting? You know, you don't want to spend $75,000 on a CPA.
Yeah.
And are those costs applicable? Can you use the SBIR money
Yeah.
for those costs?
So administering SBIR grants and contracts. A little bit later on, just in a few minutes, we're going to talk about the difference between grants and contracts. Administering grants as opposed to contracts is a little easier, okay? So administering a contract is a little bit more labor intensive. But in both cases, as a general statement, the overall burden is minimal as far as what it costs to administer SBIRs, assuming you do things right up front, you understand the rules, and you have the right cost accounting systems in place, okay? It is not hard to manage, but yes, there are processes you have to have. The reporting requirements are not typically very stringent. The accounting requirements are standing accounting requirements, but they're ones that a lot of gunsling and entrepreneurs don't typically pay attention to until they get federal contracts and grants. But overall, the administrative management of these is not, in my estimation, burdensome. Yes, the costs of general administration is part of the allowable indirect cost rate, and the only substantive cost you will likely to incur for the granting agencies may come in to, you have to have a yellow book audit, so an external audit of your books. This is not a government audit, this is where you hire an accounting firm to do a government accounting related or a yellow book's called audit. That is a cost that you'll incur, but it's allowable in the indirect costs. Okay? So that's the short answer to what's a much longer question and why I've got someone in my office who specializes in that area and can go through all the details with you. Okay?
Follow-up question to the right of acquisition. What if you develop something through SBIR funding which is already widely bought? Can you then say, my gizmo is SBIR funded and meets the specs that everybody else uses, so you have to now buy from me?
My guess is if you developed it with SBIR, it's not already widely bought, or they wouldn't have funded your SBIR to begin with. So that's an unusual
Example,
question.
I have a laboratory reagent which is 10 times better than the current laboratory reagent, but the current market for the current reagent is $50 million a year from federal sources.
So if yours is that much better, it meets a spec that's beyond what the current product is spec'd in at.
Correct.
So it's only when they request the additional specification. That's the way I think this is, and I think that's how that's answered. By the way, I am not an expert on the acquisition preference. My goal is to make you aware of it, and then if it's relevant to you, I can send you to people who are. Okay? Okay. Yeah. All right, so that's all the cool stuff from reauthorization. So we're doing good. Let's now talk about your homework that you need to do, because now you've got to find an agency in a solicitation, okay? So let's talk about the differences between the agencies and some ways you can do your homework. I like to make sure that your terminology is correct, and you've already heard me being somewhat deliberate about my use of the words grant, okay? So first thing to note is there is no such thing as an unsolicited SBIR or STTR. Every proposal that is submitted must respond to a solicitation. The 11 agencies that are subject to the legislation have to release at least one solicitation a year in order to spend the money. That solicitation may be called a funding opportunity, it might be called an RFA, it might be called a program announcement. There's many different ways to name it, but it's a solicitation and you must respond to it. You will respond by submitting a proposal, okay? So, or an application, but we tend to call it a proposal. So you are submitting a proposal in response to a solicitation, and if successful, you will receive an award, a funding award. And the agencies have the option to use either a granting mechanism or a contracting mechanism, and we'll talk about the differences to those in just a minute. So not all SBIRs are grants, some are contracts, okay? So it's important, and they're administered somewhat differently as far as reporting requirements and whatnot are concerned. Unfortunately, there is no one-stop, easy shop to get all SBIR information that you need. The federal portal sponsored by the SBA is SBIR.gov. Unfortunately, the SBA they got a little bolus of money a couple of years ago to fix up this website, but it's still not as robust as it could be or it should be. I want you to note something though. This website has just become an order of magnitude more important to you. Because as you'll see in a little bit, there's a registration that you are now going to have to do at this website. So every SBIR agency has registration requirements. They're a little bit challenging. This is a new registration requirement that all agencies have to implement as a result of reauthorization. So for those of you submitting proposals in the near future, please note that with the reissue of the NIH Omnibus solicitation next week, they are going to require, you guys, it sounds like they are going to require registration at SBIR.gov. Okay, all of the other agencies that have open solicitations, including NSF and DOD, already require it, and any subsequent solicitations that come out will require it. This also has a search engine where you can search under proposals from past years, and it's got announcements on events and training sessions and things like that. So it's a good website for you to visit. It also has a link to all 11 agencies' SBIR websites. So it makes it an easy place to go to link through to the agencies. Here's another website, and I bring this up. This one's been in existence a long time as well. And at some point, the hope is, because this is run by a private individual who's passionate about SBIR, the SBA's website will actually obsolete this one. And he will very happily shut this one down when the SBA's does. But there's one thing that this website does that we like to point out. It does most of the other functions of the agent that I mentioned of the other one. But this one allows you to search both open and closed solicitations. So if every agency has to release at least one solicitation a year, and the agency that you are interested in currently doesn't have anything open, how do you figure out what an agency solicitation might look like? Well, you search past solicitations. Also, as we're about to get to in a minute, one of the primary differences between granting agencies and contracting agencies has to do with whose ideas they fund. DOD is the largest contracting agency. Whose ideas do you think they fund? Theirs. NIH is the largest granting agency. Whose ideas does NIH fund? Yours, investigator initiated. So when DOD funds their own ideas, where do you think some of those ideas come from? You guys. But you've got to let them know you exist. You cannot, so with an NIH or an NSF solicitation, you can be very strategic. You can say, whenever I'm ready to write, there'll be a solicitation within the next 4 to 6 months available to me. With DOD, you can wait for years for a topic to come out that you can respond to because they're topic specific. So the goal is to be strategic with an agency like DOD, make them aware of what you're doing, so if your building material is something that DOD should need and want for buildings out in the desert with certain properties, they might not know that your technology exists. So the idea is, can I do my intelligence to see if DOD has ever needed this in the past, and who within this very large organization might have needed it? And if you go to this website and search on closed solicitations, you will pull up old DOD topics and associated with that topic what's called the TPOC, Technical Point of Contact, the person who was responsible for that topic. As you'll see this afternoon, what DOD does as a contracting agency, when they release a solicitation, is they pre-release the topics, and the topics have a contact person, this TPOC. You don't submit proposals during pre-release. Because it's a contract solicitation, guess what they do when they start accepting proposals? You can no longer contact them at that point, so they remove the TPOC's contact information. If you go to DoD's website directly and search for old topics, you will find the topics, but you won't find the contact person. If you search here, you'll find the contact people as well. So it's a very good resource for those of you that want to look generically across agencies, but specifically to the contracting agencies where there are topic-specific ideas and you want to see where within those agencies and who within those agencies was sponsoring those topics. Okay? So I mentioned before that there are 11 agencies, and it's like we're just going to get off the superhighway of SBIR, and now we've got 11 different roads to go down. This is the frustrating part of SBIR and STTR. Congress gave the agencies a lot of flexibility to design the programs to meet their needs. This is good for the agencies. It's challenging for you because each agency is now going to do things a little differently. Differences include things on this list, a couple of which we'll explore. When a solicitation is released, how long it's open, varies how many there are per year, varies between the agencies. Whether they award grants or contracts, and I'm going to talk in a minute just a little bit more about that, varies between the agencies. Who reviews your proposal? Internal agency personnel or external peer reviewers? Varies by agency. Has anyone in here been a reviewer for one of the agencies? Which agency?
NIH.
Okay, on SBIR study section, standing study section, or both? Standing study section. Okay, so there's one of your peer reviewers for an agency like NIH. Very different than the way DoD reviews proposals. How much money you get varies by agency. We've already talked about that a little bit. The success rates vary somewhat by agency. And then the last three items are ones that don't affect your proposal. They affect what happens if you're funded. Because if you're funded, sometimes entrepreneurs lose sight of the fact that, woohoo, I got the grant. But what is one of the quickest things that will make a company go out of business? Cash flow. Cash flow. You can have $1 million grant, but if you can't get the cash and you can't pay your employees and your rent, what will happen? You can still shut down with $1 million grant that's been awarded to you. So how the agencies release the money to you, whether or not there's any discretionary funds. So this gentleman over here wants to pay for some business-related activities. Actually, most agencies have the ability to allow you to have some limited amount of discretionary funds, which is usually referred to as profit or fee, which is the only monies that you can spend on anything you want. You can pay someone in Canada with the profit or fee. Okay? And then how we address the gap between phase 1 and phase 2, which some of you have now realized can be fairly lengthy. Those are differences between the agencies. So now there's a lot of strategic planning you have to do to understand, A, to find an agency, and B, to figure out how to respond to that agency solicitation. Two things you can do with every agency, and it's really important that you do it. One, look at past solicitations. Two, even more importantly, search their databases of previously funded projects. You will not see the full proposal. You will see abstracts, and it can be very powerful in helping you figure out who funded what, what's appropriate for a phase 1, what's appropriate for a phase 2, by looking at the history of who's been funded before. We maintain a nice set of resources on our website, bbcetc.com. That includes links to all the agencies. So in addition to those other two websites, you can certainly visit ours. I just did a screenshot the other day to show you what's currently open. So NIH, Health and Human Services, it's like the 7-Eleven of SBIR agencies. They're open all the time, okay? So as we'll review somewhat briefly this afternoon, they have what's called an omnibus solicitation that comes out in January. It's open for 12 months. It has 3 review cycles. They're the most flexible of all the agencies in that if you're not ready now, you can apply to the next cycle. National Science Foundation, who we'll also take a look at this afternoon, has separate phase 1 and phase 2 deadlines, and they have separate SBIR and STTR solicitations. What they're doing now is different than what they did last year. They have 2 concurrent solicitations open in SBIR and in STTR that actually have the same technical topic areas, which are very broad, and that's different than what they did last year. But there's one difference between the STTR and the SBIR in addition to the eligibility rules, and has to do with something called NSF lineage. Is there anyone in here who's got basic research funding from NSF or working with someone who does? Yeah, so are you looking at the NSF STTR solicitation that's due in June?
Maybe.
Yeah, well, too bad. I wish you and I had met about 10 weeks ago, because they're giving very strong preference in the STTR solicitation to projects with NSF lineage. But unfortunately, pulling something together between now and through the 11th or the 13th of June is going to be pretty impossible. Okay, so that's, and I'll talk about that more this afternoon. That's a heads up for future NSF solicitations. Department of Defense has one of 5 solicitations currently open, and we'll explore that a little bit this afternoon. And then EPA has something open, and then the next DoD solicitation will be coming out later. And anything you don't see up there means they have nothing open right now, but they will in the future, okay? 2 kinds of agencies. So Congress comes to you and says, hey, you agency, you have to set aside money for these small businesses. Well, the granting agencies, agencies like NIH, agencies like NSF, agencies like Department of Energy to some extent, although they're a little bit like confused right now. They're used to funding investigator-initiated research. So SBIR was a logical extension for them. Agencies like NIH and NSF love it when science that they funded at universities translates into product development in companies that will have impact in the market. And so they're really used to funding investigator-initiated ideas through basic research, and now they translate that to SBIR and STTR. So an agency like NIH or NSF have a mission. NIH's mission is to improve human health. NSF's mission is to advance the national security, welfare, health, education. It's like motherhood and apple pie, it's everything. They say, you, the researchers out in the field, you, the entrepreneurs, know better than we do what cutting-edge technologies can solve critical problems in the market. So although we have technical areas we're interested in, we accept your ideas. So unsolicited ideas in solicited proposals, investigator-initiated. Those are granting agencies. Now take a look at DoD. DoD needs stuff. They need all kinds of stuff. They need tanks. They need armor. They need medical devices. They need information and intelligence systems. They need all kinds of stuff. Congress comes to them and says, you DoD have to set aside 3-point-whatever% of your budget to fund these guys. They go, seriously, really? And if you ever hear of anybody refer to the SBIR tax, that's one of the engineers within the DoD that does not like having to set aside their budget for small businesses. But regardless, they have to do it. So they come up with very, very, very specific topics that they think are suited for small businesses to develop technologies to solve problems in the military. The long-term goal of DoD is procurement. So ultimately, DoD is putting out topics, at least the idea is, that they want to procure. Whereas NIH, NSF will never be your customer. So they use the 2 different mechanisms for very specific reasons. The granting agencies are NIH, National Science Foundation, Agriculture, Energy, and sometimes Education. All of the other agencies, so NASA, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, EPA, Transportation, Commerce, sometimes Education, are the contracting agencies. And NIH actually sets aside about 5% of their overall budget through a contract solicitation. In a grant solicitation, you write a proposal. You propose what you think is appropriate to do within the constraints of SBIR that will have impact in the market, investigator initiated. If you are successful in getting funded, you will get a notice of grant award. That is your legal document. It's essentially saying, here's the money, good luck, let us know how you do. So from your question as far as compliance, accounting compliance is accounting compliance. You don't count the beans right, you're in trouble. But beyond accounting compliance with a grant, NIH literally says, here's the money, good luck. You need to change some things, because how many of you do science and it always goes exactly as you think? Yeah, so you got to make some changes, right? You have a lot of leeway to rebudget, to change the way you're doing your experiments, as long as you continue to pursue the overall aims, prove the hypothesis, achieve the objectives. Good luck, let us know how you did. Oh, good, you were successful, write us a report and submit your phase 2. And you don't have a lot of contact with agency personnel throughout the course of the grant, unless you need it. Contracting agencies say, we want this, here's the deliverables, you said you can do it, here's a contract. We want monthly status reports and updates, and the TPOC will author the topic, will review the proposal, is the person who's going to monitor your progress. Oops, things aren't going too well, what do you need to do? Contact them, ask for permission to make changes. So a contracting mechanism is a lot less flexible from the standpoint of how you manage the work, and you will have a much closer relationship with the people at the agency. The long-term goal of a contracting agency, procurement. The long-term goal of a granting agency, impact in the market, okay? And I'll try and explain how this works a little more this afternoon when we explore those agencies, all right? Any questions on this? This is one of the most fundamental concepts that you have to understand. Question? No. So, and it's again, if anyone comes to me and says, you know, hey Lisa, I attended that workshop you did in Stony Brook last year. Oh, did you ever submit a proposal? Well, no, you know, I didn't. I looked through the whole NIH solicitation and I didn't see anything that I was doing. There was no topic for me to respond to. NIH, as you'll see this afternoon, has an omnibus solicitation. Anything that you think will improve human health, you can send it in. So when you tell me that, I think, oh, I didn't do a very good job of explaining this concept of investigator-initiated. Similarly, if you said to me, oh yeah, we submitted a proposal to DOD and it got rejected because my building material is based on concrete and they wanted building materials based on aluminum. But I thought my concrete was better, so I submitted it anyways, and they didn't even review it. That's how specific a DOD solicitation can be, but how broad an NIH solicitation can be. And we have a grant versus a contract mechanism, which meets those two types of projects appropriately from a management perspective for the agency. Make sense?
I do have a question. You have 95% of dollars under HHS and 5%, I see it's 5% of HHS.
Yeah, so what NIH does, so NIH in general as an investigator-initiated agency will take whatever you guys send it. But that gives them no control over getting projects for certain priorities, and they do want some limited control over making sure that certain medical and clinical issues are addressed. So they have two ways to do that. One is through what we call special grant solicitations, and I'll show you that very briefly this afternoon. They have an omnibus solicitation. NIH is a very interesting agency, and it's different than the others. This omnibus solicitation has probably 90% of their overall budget, and it's for anything you guys propose. They have about 5% that they put into special grant solicitations, which are narrowing the focus a little bit, but they're still grants. And then they have a contract solicitation. It comes out once a year. It comes out in April. Proposals are due in November. National Cancer Foundation participates quite heavily in it. Heart, Lung, and Blood is starting to participate. So a number of institutes at NIH participate. It is a contract solicitation. Specific topics. You submit the proposal differently, and you will be managed. You'll be working much more collaboratively with NIH. The difference between the NIH contract and the DoD contract is NIH still will not be your customer. So they use the contract mechanism as a way to control certain high priority areas, but it's not a procurement role, if that makes sense.
Does the DoD have no open solicitation ever?
Not through SBIR and STTR. So if you want to be more open with DoD, you want to start to look for things like broad agency announcements, which will be much broader and much general, and those are trolling mechanisms that DoD will use to say we're interested in healthcare IT solutions, or what do you have? And so a broad agency announcement is going to be different. It's not, but then it won't be restricted to small businesses either. So there are no grants through DoD through the SBIR and STTR programs. Yes, sir?
Are the grants and or contracts taxable as income to the?
Yeah, so any revenue that you get, whether it's a grant or a contract, if you don't spend it, is taxable income. That is absolutely correct. Now, depending on how the agency awards the money, typically you don't get it ahead of time. You either get it as you spend it or you get it in arrears. So typically you've already spent it as you've gotten it, so there should be nothing left to tax. But if you draw down grant or contract revenue and do not spend it in that year, it is taxable. That is correct.
It's taxable for that year, you have to refund the unused money back to the?
No, you just pay the government income tax on it. If it's sitting in your bank, now NIH won't let you do that. That's one of those accounting things that can get you in trouble. So you can't draw down NIH's money unless you've already spent it, with the exception of the fee or profit, which is no more than 7%. And so that's an accounting thing. And by the way, these questions we cover in more detailed training. But yes, the short answer is, and I'm sorry, sometimes I don't give short answers when I should. It's taxable if you don't spend it.
Also, are there guidelines as to what you can pay the participants in the project?
Depends on the agency, but in general, yes. Each agency will have different guidelines. Okay, so there's the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, which govern everything that the federal government spends money on, but then underneath the FAR for each agency, and when we talk about budgets and various trainings I do, we talk about there are differences between agencies, there are differences between mechanisms within an agency, and then there's the overall FAR. So you have to be familiar with the agency's mechanism guidelines as well as that agency's guidelines. That's correct. That's why this is more than a 6 hour, that we're giving you I'm giving you hopefully enough information to leave here and say, yes, I want to do this, and then we'll help you figure out, someone will help you figure out that kind of stuff. So the question is, does manufacturing scale-up qualify for SBIRs and STTRs, essentially? And again, in most cases, the answer is no. In most cases, what SBIR wants to fund is the core technology innovation. And then if manufacturing and scale-up, you need money to do it, but it's fairly straightforward, then the answer is no. However, there are some agencies that are interested in enabling technologies for manufacturing, NSF being one of them, in which case that might be SBIR fundable. But to go from one widget to 1,000,001 widgets is probably not SBIR fundable in and of itself. And that's, again, a general answer. It will be agency and project specific. All right, so I want to talk very quickly about registrations. In order to be ready to apply for SBIRs, you have to have a legal entity. The legal entity has to have an EIN number. An EIN number is given to you by the IRS. And by the way, this is all online in 8 million places, so I see people frantically unwriting, but you'll get these with other places. So an EIN number from the IRS, you then have to get a DUNS number, you have to have a bank account that's associated with that EIN number, you have to register in the System for Award Management, which is fairly new, and if any of you were registered in the Central Contractor Registry in the past, and you have not checked to see how your data migrated to SAM, you might be in for a rude awakening. If that sentence makes sense to you, CCR to SAM, and you haven't checked, heads up, and then this new company registry with SBIR.gov. But I wanted to make you aware of the fact that you've got registrations you have to do. And now we're at a perfect stopping point, okay?
You are fantastic.
Oh.